Japan is a unique country with the most unpredictable fate. Why is the most promising country, at first glance, suffering from an economic crisis for the last 30 years? How did Japan, until recently isolated from the rest of the world, become a powerful state that captured humanity with its technology? Let's reveal the secrets of this amazing country together. And before you start, please subscribe to the channel and like this video, as this will greatly help me. 20,000 years ago, it was possible to reach Japan by land. It was a peninsula connected to Asia by an isthmus. But a decade later, the water level rose greatly, flooding all land routes. Since then, Japan has become an island archipelago. Residents of the country were among the first to master ceramics. Therefore, many believe that the Japanese are one of the most ancient civilizations on Earth. It's not for nothing that everyone says that Japan is ahead of the whole world. But was this always true? In the mid-19th century, the main trade routes ran through the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, between Europe, India, and the United States. But no one wanted to go to Japan because it was far away. And there was no point in this, because at that time Japan deliberately wanted to isolate itself from the whole world. The Japanese authorities were afraid of foreign cultural influence and disruption of order in their country. Therefore, they reduced communication with foreigners to a minimum, and the Japanese were forbidden to leave their lands. And while the Industrial Revolution was underway in Europe and the States, Japan remained a huge village where people paid taxes in rice. At that time, the country was not ahead, on the contrary, lagging behind the civilizational world by several decades. Over time, the United States actively began to engage in trade relations with China. But the road across the Pacific Ocean was long and not very easy, and the only transfer point was Japan, isolated from everyone. The Emperor of Japan ordered the guards to kill on-the-spot foreigners who land in the country without permission. In 1867, Emperor Meiji ascended the throne with new reforms. A civil war began in Japan, in which a year and a half later power was voluntarily transferred to Meiji. The new emperor wanted to preserve traditional values, but move away from outdated habits. He wanted the Japanese to now be able to receive and apply knowledge gained from all over the world. In the 1870s, a Japanese delegation led by Ambassador Iwakura Tomomi spent 3 years getting acquainted with the Western world. They visited 120 towns and villages in the States and Europe. Japanese leaders willingly adopted foreign traditions. For example, in the general photo of the delegation, only Iwakura is wearing a Japanese kimono, and all the other mission participants are in Western business suits. Having gained experience, the Japanese understood what needed to be done in order to bring about an industrial revolution in their country. Equality was proclaimed among all inhabitants of the empire. The samurai ceased to exist. A unified monetary system, the yen, was introduced, and a 3% tax on all lands. The former mints became private banks owned by a family of elites from a bygone era, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and others. In 1870, the first telegraph line appeared in Japan, and in 1872 the first railway was opened between Tokyo and Yokohama. Until recently, poor Japanese were doomed to work all their lives in a rice field for their feudal lord. But now they can get a job in another city by traveling there by train. Japan was rapidly becoming an industrial state, but the empire lacked coal and iron. In order to obtain the necessary natural resources, Japan went to war with China and captured Taiwan, and in 1905 won the war with Russia, which resulted in the annexation of Korea 5 years later. Japan did not take an active part in the First World War, but the country began preparing for World War II long before it began. Germany, Italy, and Japan signed an agreement on the division of spheres of influence in the world after the end of the war. This time, the land of the rising sun made a number of strategic mistakes and lost the war. For the first time in history, nuclear weapons were used on Japanese territory, killing 4% of the entire population and leaving another 10% homeless. The country's territories are taken by the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. The country was again under Western rule, which established an anti-war movement in Japan. In 1947, a new constitution was adopted that prohibited Japan from having its own army. The economy in the country during this period was very bad. Japan was saved only by the active phase of the Cold War. When the USSR and China began to move closer after World War II, America decided to make Japan its ally, not its enemy. In 1950, the Korean War began, where the northern part attacked the southern. Korea was a Japanese colony before World War II, and after 1945, the northern part was under the occupation of the Soviet Union, and the southern part was occupied by the United States. America did not want to give South Korea to the communists and located its command headquarters in Japan. This is what helped the Japanese load their enterprises with orders for the U.S. Army. This was beneficial for both parties because it was much more expensive to carry all goods from the States. In 1952, a peace treaty was signed with the United States, which led to the end of the occupation of Japanese territories. The Japanese economy has fully recovered. In 1955, what would later be called the Japanese economic miracle began. The growth of industrial production amounted to 11% per year. Not bad for a country that was in ruins just 10 years ago. The essence of the Japanese economic miracle is the mutual trust between the state and business, incredible for any other country in the world. If the state asked business to invest in metallurgy, then business did it. With benefit for yourself, since taxation has been optimized. First metallurgy, then petrochemistry, shipbuilding. The country began to produce 100 million tons of steel per year, ranking second in the world by this indicator. In the 60s, the world was ruled by rock and roll and the sexual revolution, and the Japanese were preparing for the second stage of conquering the world.
Unbelievable that this little piece of junk could be such a big problem. No wonder this circuit failed. It says made in Japan.
What do you mean, Doc?
Made in Japan in those days meant that it was a cheap and often low-quality product. The government decided to put an end to this. The development of consumer industries is becoming a new priority for the Japanese economy. The two most important of them are electronics and cars. Companies from these industries receive maximum government support. Without trying to make the yen an expensive currency, the government is supporting exports. Knowledge and technology did not appear out of nowhere. At first, the Japanese bought patents all over the world, and then, when they earned more money from selling their goods abroad, they began to actively invest in research and development themselves. Between 1950 and 1960 alone, Japanese companies bought more than 30,000 patents worth about $1 billion. And this investment was a very smart move. In the 1970s, Japan became an important player in the world market because it produced quality goods at low prices. American companies were losing money because the Japanese were more successful. In response to this, the United States decided to reduce the value of its currency. At that time, the dollar was very strong, which made American goods expensive and not very in demand. Therefore, the United States offered its partners a deal. Japan and other countries would sell part of their dollar reserves and raise interest rates, and the United States would lower theirs. This was supposed to help American goods become more competitive and partners to invest in the United States at a more favorable rate. In 1985, the parties signed an agreement and everyone was supposed to remain in the black. But it was this agreement that marked the beginning of the resolution of the Japanese economy. Everything went just fine. The Japanese are buying up American companies and shares. Japanese major cities are becoming a magnet for money and stars from all over the world. Every year there are more and more people, and real estate prices are rising sharply. Following this, shares of Japanese companies are growing. Average price of 1 square meter in Tokyo was $25,000. Banks issued a huge number of loans for the purchase of real estate, which people still purchased for such crazy money. But the country's economy stopped growing due to the export of goods, since their prices increased greatly and became unprofitable. A huge speculative bubble has inflated in the Japanese real estate and land markets. At the peak of prices, land in Japan was more expensive than land in the rest of the globe. Naturally, this price level was in no way justified economically, and in 1991 the bubble burst. Since then, land prices have fallen by more than half, and real estate prices in some places by 10 or even 100 times. Japan found itself in a deep crisis. In 1989, of the 50 most valuable companies in the world, 32 were Japanese. To date, only Toyota remains in this rating. Japan is a unique country with the oldest population in the world. Older people work less and consume less, which has a very bad effect on the economy. The country's population continues to age, but the standard of living in Japan still remains high. Will Japan become the world's greatest economy again? If so, what should happen? Let's think about this topic in the comments. Write what you learned for the first time today and what surprised you the most. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support really motivates me to create new videos. Thank you all so much for watching and see you in the next videos.